Hi class, it's Miss Tran. Welcome back. Today our lesson will be focusing on how to identify an epic simile. So now we're all very familiar with figurative language such as metaphors, personification, and of course similes. Similes refer to comparing two unlike things using like or as. And even today in our everyday language, we use similes as common idioms such as tough as nails, clear as crystal, thin as ice, and the list goes on. So the epic simile is an extension of that and makes language more elaborate in writing. And this is evident in the Odyssey. So taking a closer look, we have what is an epic simile? So Homer, knowing that he was an orator, and an orator was an individual who had to recite speeches and verses in front of masses of audiences because they didn't have any recording equipment back then. Remember, this was back in 180 BC. So he had to encourage his audiences to think in a different perspective. In other words, see the scenes that he was reciting. And coming up with this idea and originating these similes called the epic simile, he also named them Homeric similes. And Homeric similes basically are an elaborate comparison, and these comparisons are developed over several lines. So if we've noticed as reading the Odyssey, some of these chunks of text can range from 20 lines or more, just comparing these two unlike things. And it refers to trying to connect something strange or unfamiliar to something more familiar. And this was how Homer established his credibility, this pathos with his audience, by using epic similes in his writing. So this connects to the movies that we see nowadays. And if we take a look, we have the Avengers. And in a way, these scenes just alone kind of represent what epic similes are. Now, not in writing per se, but if we take a look at cinematography, and particularly in action movies, they try to make everything huge. This portrayal of action, movement, sound effects, the list goes on. So if we look at these standstill scenes of action movies, they kind of stand as epic similes themselves because they try to put all the action into one scene to show audiences to think, wow, okay, now I know what's going on. This is how the thrill that's going on in my mind should follow along with the movie. And if we're drawing this connection, Homer in his writing tried to do the same thing, and it followed the form of blank is like blank, except he would write 20 or so more lines to elaborate on this concept of comparing one unfamiliar thing to something that is more familiar. So let's take a look at this in more depth. We have these different purposes of the epic simile, and the epic similes are recognized as concomitants of battle scenes and also serve these purposes. Concomitant meaning that they're naturally occurring. Epic similes were just inserted in his writing to show that they're naturally associated with action. So some of these purposes included suspending the action of the scene, so making sure that the reader's interests were maintained, and also redirecting the reader's attention, showing that maybe the scene should be focusing on the object or the symbol, or maybe the battle scene between the two characters like Antinous and Odysseus. Battle scenes using epic similes also help characters foreshadow events and glorify the stature of characters. So if we see these epic similes in the Odyssey, we can see Odysseus glorifying himself as a hero and having all these characteristics that are emphasized to show readers that, wow, they should value these in their society. And there's also this very important sense of heightening the physical and mental movement of the scene. Now that sounds a little abstract, but what I mean by that is there's always this physical aspect of writing that's described how a character looks, what a scene looks like. And by looking at what it is from the outset, we can kind of imagine in our heads that this is what feelings should be associated with it. And that's what we mean by heightening the sense of physical and mental movement. And of course, back then, knowing that there wasn't any recording equipment, nothing stated in stone, Homer's job was to make the unfamiliar concept more familiar with audiences. Now let's take a look at understanding the epic simile in detail. So this is the scene that we have read before, and it is a Cyclops scene where Odysseus decides to take a glowing axe and stab it into Polyphemus's eyes. Now, I'm going to show you the steps of how to identify an epic simile when it comes to reading these verses, which can get pretty dense, and we're going to go through it step by step. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to read it out loud. So here it goes. Its crackling roots blazed and hissed as a blacksmith plunges a glowing axe or adze in an ice-cold bath, and the metal screeches steam and its temper hardens. That's the iron strength. So the eye of Cyclops sizzled round that stake. So there's a lot of alliteration there. There's onomatopoeia. But what we're focusing on right now in terms of figurative language is the simile. So let's start with the basics. The simile is comparing two unlike things using either like or as. So your key word here is to look for either like or as. And if we take a look at this quote, as would be your indicator word. And if we're referring back to the earlier part of the PowerPoint lecture, it's that formula between blank, like blank. So what are the two objects or things that are being compared in here? We have its crackling roots blazed and hissed. That's one. So we're referring to the Cyclops' eyes. That's the first object that's being compared. Your indicator word is as, and then the part that comes after that is a blacksmith plunges a glowing axe. So there we are. We have number two. A blacksmith plunges a glowing axe. So the epic simile here that we have is comparison between the Cyclops' eyes and the blacksmith plunging a glowing axe in a cold bath, right? So these are the two things that are being compared and weighed, and the epic simile basically does an extension of that. We have this whole verse of text just elaborating on that language, on that imagery, and how it should be portrayed and how it should even sound as we're reading it aloud in our minds. So it's important to also not just look at the epic simile at its face value. So yeah, we have two objects that are being compared. We have the Cyclops' eyes and the blacksmith plunging this metal rod into ice cold water. What does that all mean? So let's look at this in even more detail. So we have denotation, and denotation is the literal meaning or dictionary definition of a word, or it is also the explicit description of an image. So in this case, the denotation of the epic simile is the sizzling sounds of the Cyclops' eye is compared to sticking fire-hot metal into cold water. On the other hand, we also have the connotation, and the connotation refers to the suggestive meanings. And this is what I mean when we're looking at the physical and mental aspects of looking at epic similes. So these suggestive meanings are the emotions that we associate with reading the description of the Cyclops and what's going on in the scene. So in this case, our interpretation would be the contrast between fire and ice represents the division between good and evil in Odysseus' epic battle. Now, this is not to say that this is the only interpretation of the scene. There could be many. This is one aspect that we can keep in mind when we're looking at the epic simile from a different perspective. So what does this all mean? Well, for one thing, the epic similes that Homer used in his writing connect directly to our lives and how we view movies nowadays. Even though we don't use writing as epic similes in our writing, our action movies use aspects of it by using the cinematography of lighting, sound effects, music, costume to make it all elaborate, to make us enjoy these moments of passion in these scenes, to elaborate on these scenes on how we should react to certain actions or characters and so forth. So by drawing the connection between oratory and movies nowadays, we see how the epic simile functions and creating these images, but also making us associate certain feelings and emotions when we watch or read it. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed the lecture, and we will be working with this concept of the epic simile in class by looking at denotations and connotations in more detail. Thank you.